Thanks everyone for taking the time to come to our talk and listen to our journey on preparing for systems of record in the cloud. Effectively, this is the talk. When putting this talk together, Matt and I decided that we wanted to make this talk the one that we wished we'd had exposure to about 2 years ago when we started on this journey. This is really a talk from the trenches. It's kind of what we want to do is share the insights and the learnings that we've kind of gotten over that period. Basically, we want to talk about the shift in thinking conceptually from transitioning non-critical workloads to AWS versus the shift around what you might need to consider when you start to look at material workloads or systems of record. What I want to do is just kind of talk about that terminology though a little bit. So systems of record in the context of this talk is really those crown jewel systems, or those systems that basically if they were to go away, your ability to service your customers would be severely impeded. It could lead to erosion of customer trust, heightened scrutiny from regulators and potentially fines, or basically irreparable damage to your brand at worst case. So in the context of that kind of thinking, this talk should be relevant to both large-scale enterprise as well as startups, to both public and private sector organisations. And so we'll basically kick off.
Thanks, Wayne. So at NIB, we have a vision for people all around the world enjoying better health. This really starts with our core value proposition centred around health insurance and protecting our members against things like disease, sickness or injury and the financial implications of those. From there, we've been really focused, I guess, over the last few years in broadening that value proposition out, looking at expanding into the New Zealand and the Asian markets, as well as acquiring a number of travel insurance companies and bringing them together to provide that, world-class care wherever our members are travelling. And then most recently, we've been really focused on helping our members better predict, manage and treat their illnesses. And so a lot of the work we're doing in that space is talking about becoming a health partner right across the health journey, not just the payer of claims at the end. And so we're thinking a lot about how we can use technologies and digital technologies to really drive that health partnership. From a tech perspective as well, we've been really focused on laying the foundations over the last 5 or so years. We wanted to make sure we had the right cloud and data platforms in place, and our cloud and data strategy has been a big part of this, making sure they're secure, elastic, resilient, and can host and enable the business on that journey that they're going on. Building out modern digital experiences as well, so web and APIs built on top of those platforms. And then I guess most relevant to this talk, we've been really focused on what does the next generation core system look like for NIB in terms of maintaining policies, maintaining the benefits for our customers, and how we start to break that apart into something that's more modular, scalable, and really be capability driven. And a lot of this is being born on the cloud or transitioned to the cloud. And I also wanted to dive a little deeper on our cloud vision, just to kind of recap where we've been and what we've been doing. So about 4 years ago, we put together this vision over here. It's what we call our cloud first strategy. Wayne and I didn't draw that. We're certainly not that gifted, but we sat with one of our designers and said, try to workshop what was the world we were moving from and the world we were moving to. And so for us, it really came to light that we were spending a lot of time focused in IT on maintaining boxes or maintaining the infrastructure, and not a lot of time on enabling the business and driving competitive advantage. And so our business case then was really shaped around these 6 pillars that you see up there. A big part of it was driving that innovation culture, being agile, helping our business experiment. We also wanted to improve our cyber and risk posture, while at the same time increase our resiliency. So through those acquisitions that I mentioned, we went from 2 data centers to 7 data centers. And so we really were focused on making sure those data centers were secure, but it was really, really difficult and hard to keep up with the pace the business was moving at. And then lastly, we were really focused on efficiencies as well, and not just reduce operating costs of consolidating those data centers, but also looking at a common group platform. So we were bringing on development teams in New Zealand and in Sydney and across in Newcastle, as well as right around the globe. And so we wanted to build a common platform that those development teams could build on top of. This vision and this business case has really been a key artifact for us as well. It's something we've shared with our executives, our board, and externally as well with our regulators such as APRA and other auditors, to really explain why we're doing this, why we're moving to the cloud, and it really helped us have those conversations. And it wasn't just all about reducing costs for us. There was really a business driver that was tied to it. And then just recapping on our transition approach, like I said, we've sort of been at it for close to 4 years now. We really have taken a cautious and measured approach. So one step at a time, we started with a proof of concept late in 2015. A lot of that was really centered on proving out those things we had in that vision. So, we had words in there like self-healing systems and being able to increase security through the cloud. And back then, a lot of that was heresy, like, oh, you couldn't have a better security through the cloud, and what's a self-healing system? So we really had to set out to prove that it wasn't just ideological. And so it went really well, and we took that to our board late in 2015 and had a discussion with them about why we were doing it, what we've learned, what the benefits are going to be, and we obtained board sign-off. And we moved into our first release then early in 2016. We had our first production release. And from there, we continued ramping up, and somewhere around the middle of 2017, we had about 100 apps live on our platform. But running in parallel to this, we were also maturing our platform, and we obtained full PCI compliance for all the applications that were running on our cloud platform, which was a big win for the business. We'd been working towards that for a long time. And then we launched our flagship innovation piece, Nibby the chatbot, late in 2017, again, built on our cloud platform in a cloud-native way. And this really goes to the business case of being able to innovate and experiment. It's not something we could have done quite easily with our on-premise infrastructure. So it was early 2018, we'd probably moved about 90 to 95% of our applications onto the cloud. And so what was remaining in our data centers were our core systems, our systems of record, or other sort of material systems that were really key to our business. And so we started exploring what was that transition going to look like and how would we get there. And that's what we really want to talk today, is about our platform and how we've sort of evolved it to run those types of systems. But work didn't stop there, so late in 2018, we hit about 200 apps live roughly on the platform, so we continued migrations and greenfields apps. And then just a couple of months ago, we launched our first production instances of Amazon Connect and Workspaces, which have provided, I guess, a contact center solution and a virtual desktop solution for one of our business acquisitions that required a global presence at a number of different sites around the world. And again, it really wouldn't have been possible without the platform that we built.
So basically, when we started to think about transitioning systems of record to the cloud, of course, non-critical systems, we've been building those out with an appropriate level of capability around continuity and resiliency and those types of things. But when you start to think about those crown jewels environments, your thinking starts to turn, or our thinking certainly started to turn more towards less about the technology and more about what's the control environment, what are the expectations, and what kind of scrutiny are we bringing upon ourselves from our customers and also from our regulators, and how we're going to address that. So a lot of that first started with thinking about our risk culture. We have a very low appetite for technology risk. However, we also do have an internal kind of mantra, which is the bigger the brakes, the faster the car. And I guess the concept behind that is that we are an entrepreneurial organisation. We do want to be agile and we do want to be quick to market, but at the same time, we don't want risk to be seen, or technology risk to be seen as a blocker or a barrier to be overcome. It really should be a set of guardrails that the teams would, it sets the scene for how the teams are supposed to deliver technology in a way that manages risk in a calculated fashion. And the way that applies back to our cloud platform is baking in things like the security control capabilities and the resiliency capabilities, so that as the devs are building out services to support business initiatives, that they're getting all of that for free and they're not having to think about it as such. So we're able to enable that rapid and agile kind of innovation whilst also protecting our organisation. Some of the other factors that came into play for us to start to, I guess, guide our thinking is what's our customer expectation and what value do we place in that trust? And of course, we place a high value on that trust. But also, we're an international organisation, so we come under both local and global regulatory compliance. So we have to think about what are the expectations of those regulators. Also, when thinking about that in the context of further developing service selection and control definition, is thinking about what the overlaps are there. So if I take data protection as an example, we have the Australian privacy principles, we have GDPR, PCI, DSS, those types of things. So we kind of look at that, using that guidance as a baseline for establishing what's the highest level criteria for our control environment, and then kind of establishing our capability off that basis. And also the fact that there's constant evolution going on. We're a highly dynamic organisation, as Matt just pointed out, delivering a lot of different technology and emerging tech play services. But we're also undertaking M&As, and we're working in a situation where the regulatory environment doesn't stand still, it's not static. So we need a platform and we need capability that is adaptable to that regulatory environment. So we've got a lot of things to think about, and that can become very overwhelming very quickly when you're putting that in the context of very sensitive and critical systems and data. And we start to look for guidance, and one of the places that we got that guidance was from this APRA Cloud Computing Information paper. Now, we are APRA regulated, however, this paper, I would recommend it to anyone, regardless of whether you're public or private sector, regardless of your geographic jurisdiction and also your regulatory obligations. The great thing about this paper, there's two things. One is that it sets a risk tiering expectation up front and helps you think about the way that you conceive the criticality and sensitivity of your information assets. And the second thing is that it provides guidance on observed weaknesses around what the regulator has seen other organisations doing with their cloud adoption strategies and some of the weaknesses that they've seen in that program. And you can quite honestly play, and you have to be honest, quite honestly play that against your own program and start to think about the iterations of maturity that you might be facing. Of course, you can take all of that guidance and overlay that with control guidance provided by many, many security frameworks, NIST, ISO, etc. But then you want to get to a point where you start to evaluate the maturity and capability and the appropriateness of your service selection to support your objectives. And there's a number of ways to do that. We do that in real time through a solution called Cloud Conformity, and Matt will talk about that a little bit later. But we also use AWS Trusted Advisor and well-architected framework reports to kind of get independent assurance or guidance on what our maturity and capability looks like, whether we've actually taken service selection and the control implementations as far as we should or could, and looking for opportunities for improvement to build out our control environment. So what that really leads to is this iterative process of thinking about the context in which you're proposing to transition these critical systems and the context in which you operate, the expectations of your stakeholders, and then also looking at the maturity and, of your service selection and having that tested and then going back and kind of iterating on that maturity.
Thanks, Wayne. So I want to take a bit of a deep dive into our platform and some of the key areas that we looked at. We've got about 10 key areas that we, assessed ourselves against, and as we were preparing to go through this journey. We'll focus on probably these 5 areas. We could do a talk on all of them, but we thought these 5 areas were worth digging in a little deeper. So the first one is really touching on our operating model changes, and it's been a really key part of, running more riskier workloads in the cloud. So when we got started, we had to really think about what were our responsibilities versus what were Amazon's responsibilities as we made this transition and what did it mean to our operating model. And so a great reference we used here was the AWS Shared Responsibility Model paper. It's really worth checking out. Amazon makes it really, really clear what they will give you and what they will provide and what they won't give you and what you'll need to look after. And so for us, that really came to life through things like building out our cloud risk and cloud security processes and making sure we had the ability to assess cloud services, conduct control assessments, and really make sure that we understood where our data was and what systems it was flowing through. We also had to continue maturing our support process, and so we'd been doing a little bit of our DevOps practices internally, but we really had to embrace this and grow it right across the IT function, making sure that those teams were ensuring continuity of service through things like DR testing, and then also making sure that change management was thought about in a more modern sense, and I'll touch on that soon. And then from an architecture and strategy point of view, we sort of had these principles that we laid out earlier about moving fast and increasing security and increasing resiliency. And so we wanted to make sure that as the teams moved and built things on the platform, from a cloud architecture and security and strategy point of view, we were building those right practices in. And so the teams were adhering to our design recommendations as well as our business case. The other thing we started looking at was what were the components from a technical and a functional level that we were going to be responsible for. And so we took that orange box again from Amazon and broke it down a little further and said, okay, we're getting data centers, and then from an infrastructure perspective, we're getting compute storage network, so we don't need to worry so much about running that anymore. But what we did need to do right out the gates is build a defense in-depth virtual network right across it. And so if you've used Amazon, these are things like VPCs and the right account structure and the architecture around that. And so then we had two key pillars that we lined up against that. The first one was our security and risk controls and the principles around that. So as I mentioned earlier, aligning to things like PCI compliance. We wanted to be fully ISO aligned as well. And we brought some of our own principles like ensuring full encryption end-to-end at rest and in transit. And then making sure that we were baking in hardening and patching as we went along as well. The other key pillar for us was continuous delivery, and not just continuous delivery, but continuous assurance as well. So we wanted to make sure that as our teams built applications and delivered things onto the platform, they could do it in a fast and speedy manner, but they could have confidence that those things were being deployed and secured properly. And so this really came to life through having principles around doing vulnerability scanning much further left in the build pipeline, and I'll touch on that in a little bit as well. But also making sure that as applications were deployed, they were deployed automatically across all of the availability zones. And so the teams didn't have to think about having that resiliency, it was baked in. And then lastly, we identified a whole bunch of areas on top of that that were going to be our responsibility. And they already were, but we wanted to put even more focus on and think about how were they going to change in a cloud-first world. And so you can see simple things up there like external and internal firewalls, but we still had to do the operating system patching and the hardening of those systems, making sure databases were automated and provisioned. So there was a lot of areas that we still needed to focus on, even though those areas at the bottom were taken away. And so this came together in what we call the Red Queen platform at NIB. I won't dig into the name too much. We do have another talk from Sydney Summit that explains it. But what it really is a bunch of cloud services and cloud technologies that are wrapped around AWS at the core. And the major focus on that is really speed and safety. So making sure that our teams can move fast, can move quickly, deploy applications, but do it in a safe and secure manner. And it's really wrapped up with a whole bunch of automation and guardrails and templates. So when the teams come along, they can pick out the templates, pick out the patterns, and everything will be automatically shipped and deployed for them. You might think this is a lot of different technology vendors in the mix, but it's actually proved to be a fairly positive risk management technique as well. So if you look at something like Okta there, Okta does our single sign-on for our internal employees. We could have gone with the AWS single sign-on service, but we've actually found that having that separation is really nice from a risk management point of view. And if something did happen to AWS or Okta, the blast radius is really reduced between those two services, and our employees could continue signing on if they needed to. So I'll drill a little further into some of our foundations and patterns around this. As you can see, we've got a big focus on automating everything and treating everything as code. And so we took a step back and said, well, what's driving, I guess, our patterns and our templates? And it's really our policies and standards, both internally and externally. So looking at things like I mentioned, PCI compliance and GDPR and what the guidance is that we're getting from APRA, but also our own internal standards and information security standards we've set out. And so we translated those into codified patterns. And those are basically snippets of code that are aligning to those standards and policies that we can then roll out to our workloads in a completely automated fashion. Sorry, and then closing the loop, we're able to perform governance right around that. And then as those policies and standards evolve and change upstream, as Wayne mentioned, this is a moving target, we're able to make sure using our tools that those policies and standards are getting applied to our workloads. And if they're not, we can go back upstream, bake them in, and then roll them out to our applications in an automated fashion. From a patterns point of view, we really also set a high bar right from day one. We started with really low-risk applications that were either infrastructure or the web and API apps that didn't store sensitive customer data or anything like that. But we did full encryption at rest and at transit, and we deployed these applications across the availability zones. And it really goes to those things of resiliency and security being a priority for us over cost savings, because it wasn't any cheaper to actually run those things across those zones. It was more of setting that baseline really high. And so then from an extreme risk point of view, we wanted to make sure that we continued evolving our patterns. So we restricted the services that we were looking to use for our systems of record, made sure those AWS services went through a more stringent review process. And we also made sure we had a contingency plan in place. And I'll touch on that a little further, how that progressed. But we really wanted to make sure that we were continuously testing that contingency plan for these extreme risk workloads while running on the cloud as well. And then as Wayne alluded to earlier, AWS Well Architected was a really great framework for how we laid out and architected our environment with the 5 key pillars. But being able to govern the environment was really important too. So we took the Well Architected framework, and then we worked with Cloud Conformity as a tool to help us really analyze our environment in real time, and we can get a real-time snapshot at our governance forums. So these dials here, they move up and down on a regular basis. They'll never be at 100%, but we're able to take an individual pillar, drill in, look at the best practices as they're moving, and then continue evolving and maturing our platform out.
Thanks, Matt. So what we'd like to do is also talk a little bit about some of the thinking that goes that we took conceptually into designing out some of the security capabilities. So the APRA white paper basically talks to an observed weakness around how organisations might be identifying, protecting and detecting anomalous security events. And what we did was we looked at that through the lens of how are we going to build out all of our service selection and what's the model upon which we base this. So we've used the NIST cybersecurity framework, key or high-level domains here, as basically the bones upon which we would build that capability. What's really great about doing something like this is when you start to look at service selection, you can look at, okay, can we get everything out of AWS that we want, or do we kind of complement that with other third-party services? So here we're basically doing that for the identify process, but it also allows you to think quite sequentially or conceptually around what I build here is going to be important later on around detect and respond. So I'm identifying an anomalous event, but what am I going to do later on? And it's the service selection that I'm making now most appropriate to support that requirement. Of course, we want to try and protect the environment from an anomalous event in the first place. So again, we're using a combination of AWS and other third-party services. What we're doing here, so for basically indicators of compromise, our detection capability, we rely on SecureWorks, Security Information and Event Management Service with a 24/7/365 SOC behind that. But we're also pushing AWS GuardDuty and CloudWatch audit and monitoring logs through to the CM, so that we've got comprehensive coverage. And then in the event that we identify an anomalous problem, basically SecureWorks is firing off highly contextually rich alerts through to PagerDuty via an API. We've got a linkage there, so we're basically getting our on-call engineers to fire up and respond to the event and establishing incident response communications channels through Slack. One of the things that's really important, or we found important when using a framework like this, is not to get too hung up on stringently adhering to what NIST say. It's really using a framework to kind of guide your own thinking and give you something to kind of build out sequentially on and make sense from all of this noise. What we decided we wanted to do was kind of use the detection and respond capabilities and the output from those services and create an investigate function that would allow us to undertake post-incident forensic investigation in say something went wrong. So what we're doing here is we're taking logs from both SecureWorks as well as CloudTrail and CloudWatch and pushing them through to an immutable log bunker. In this case, we're using Sumo Logic. The reason for doing that is because if an adversary is basically cleaning up the logs behind them to hide their activities, we're actually capturing pushing those logs into Sumo and protecting them so that we can use them later with our security advisory partners to undertake post-incident response. And here we're using recovery capability. It's basically just a bunch of third-party services to fire up communications channels as well as documentation from our war room, and then also making sure that we've got all of the events of that incident captured for incident management and auditing. One of the other, I should say, going back to that, this contextually, the other great thing about building out like this and the fact that it gives you this holistic visibility is we worked very closely with our cloud transition partners and with AWS professional services to build out incident response game days. And by having this full view, it allows you to basically hone in on what particular area of our environment do we want to test an anomalous event on, what's the services that we're using to support that, and then playing that through and looking at how are those services supporting those activities, what needs more tuning, what might we throw away and introduce better services for, as well as, of course, keeping an audit or a log of all of those incident response game days, so that you can demonstrate to your auditors and or your regulators that you actually are being proactive about that. One of the other observed weaknesses in the APRA white paper is that around privileged access management and organisations potentially not doing enough to manage the elevation of privileges within production environments. So we took a fairly lofty approach to this, and we said we want to basically keep administrators from actually ever having to elevate privileges on production environments, full stop. And we're not there yet, it's a very lofty goal, but effectively what we've done is we've designed out this concept called break glass, and I'll walk you through that now. So effectively an administrator is authenticated into the platform and has a requirement to undertake, let's say, emergency administrative maintenance on an EC2 instance down there. What they do is they basically submit a request to an approver group stating who they are, what they want access to, the purpose of that access, and how long do they want that access for. The approvers, once they actually give basically the green tick and accept the administrator's request, a Lambda function fires up and unique encrypted credentials push via a run command to the EC2 instance for that particular administrative event. And that ensures that basically those credentials are there for that particular purpose. At the same time, a security group is created and establishes connection from a Bastion host to the EC2 instance, enabling the administrator access to that environment. And in this case, they've effectively broken glass at this point. As I mentioned, a timer fired up at the point when the request was approved. When the timer expires, another AWS Lambda function initiates. What it does is it tears down the security group and revokes those unique credentials. It blows away the EC2 instance and replaces that instance with a brand new instance, purely for the purposes of ensuring the integrity of the environment. End to end, that whole process is audited, monitored, and logged by CloudTrail and CloudWatch. And again, those logs are pushed to our immutable log bunker.
So as we've touched on a few times, just as important as security is to us, the resilience of our environment is also key. And so I want to walk you through what our resiliency approach is and what that looks like. And I'll touch a little bit on availability, talk about recovery, and then dig into our contingency approach. So our availability architecture is really fairly straightforward. We follow a 3-tier style architecture where we have our load balancers deployed across all 3 availability zones as well. Those load balancers have built-in health checks to drive things like self-healing events and auto-scaling if load's too heavy or an instance in the middle tier here encounters an issue or a software problem. We do try to drive all of the data out of that middle tier as well to make sure that we have everything be fully immutable and stateless. So if there is a problem with one of those servers, as sort of Wayne alluded to, we should be able to blow it away at any time, and it's really come in handy for ensuring the integrity of the environment. And then from there, at the bottom tier, we have our database and our data stores, and really make sure that everything is deployed across multiple zones there, and we're testing that failover between them quite regularly. The whole idea of this architecture, though, is built to withstand the loss of a full availability zone. And so we test that fairly often, and I'll touch on that as well in a minute. But we really want to make sure that we can withstand that loss and that we've architected appropriately for it. I guess just as important as the technology is also the people and process that are behind the technology architecture as well. And so we've got a fairly simple process for walking through availability events. And so to get started with, a lot of our patterns are already pre-built into our applications. And so as a delivery team comes along and wants to build something, they've got a bunch of standard health checks and events they get for free out of the box. From there, they can define additional logs that they want to monitor or other events. And then from there, we try to make sure detection is completely automatic, so teams don't have to be poring over the logs or investigating things that's taking up quite a bit of time. Off the back of that, we also try to make sure the actions are automatic in the first place. And so these are things like auto-scaling events or replacing unhealthy instances. Not every time we can do that completely automated. And so from there, we drive notifications into our Slack channels for our DevOps and developers to rally around and in a ChatOps style process and troubleshoot the issue. If it's after hours, the on-call engineers page by pager duty, and a similar process occurs. Off the back of that, then, as I mentioned, we have a number of teams sort of starting to spread around the globe now. They are tracking their incidents and holding post-incident reviews within their own Jira boards, making sure that they're documenting what happened in Confluence. And if it's an app-specific thing, they'll go and fix it in that application. But we also have our governance forums off the back of that, where we're able to roll up those availability incidents from those Jira boards and discuss them in our governance forums at a group level and look at, are we seeing trends or are we seeing the same availability issue occurring right across the board? And then we can build that back into our platform for all of the teams to benefit. So as I touched on earlier, we want to make sure that we're withstanding the loss of a full availability zone. And to do this, we took a page out of Netflix book, the whole Chaos Monkey approach, and we built our own tool called Gorilla. And Gorilla is really, really simple. It's basically a piece of automation that we can run, and the Gorilla comes in and smashes the availability zone and shuts it all down. And we're able to see how the applications respond to this in real time. We run this quite frequently in our non-production environments, and it's a great way for our developers to get some certainty around what their apps will do when it goes live. And we also run it in a more of a scheduled approach in our production environment, I guess akin to traditional DR testing. It's been really, really important for us to have this way of testing, proving to our auditors and our regulators that the architecture is holding up. And back in 2016, when AWS did actually lose an availability zone in Sydney, we knew exactly what would happen, and everyone slept quite quietly through the night, so that was nice. So I want to touch on recovery right now as well. So when we get started with recovery, we're looking at how we back up data. And again, we're back to codified backup policies. So we looked at what were the common types of approaches that teams were taking to backing up their data, and we codified them into a number of patterns that get applied to things like S3 buckets or databases. A lot of the time, these are aligned to our business continuity requirements or the RTOs and RPOs that the business have laid out. And then so as the team comes along, they can take those templates. Maybe their application only needs to hold data for 7 days, or maybe they need it for 7 years with a certain level of encryption. And again, we can click a button and those patterns are rolled out to all of the workloads in real time. And then that really ensures the conformance of those. If the upstream patterns are changing, we're able to reconfigure all of the buckets at once. And so it's been really important that we also ensure that we've got the right versioning and MFA delete policies centered around these buckets. And again, it's all built into those patterns up front. And so I want to step through recovery from a disruption scenario point of view. It was really important for us to step back and think about what were some of the likely scenarios that could happen to our workloads, particularly our material or extreme risk workloads. Now, I want to say things like collusion between parties and compromised credentials are much more likely than the entire AWS region going out. But at the end of the day, it sort of has the same effect on your environment. If somebody got a hold of your root credentials and wanted to wipe out the whole account, that would be pretty similar to losing the whole region for your organization. So we had to think about how we'd cater for that. And we also had to think about a number of smaller events that might occur, things like software errors, replication issues, failed deployments. And so I'll walk you through what that looks like at a high level. Effectively, our application servers and database servers are backing up their data or the things they need to recover from to a series of buckets. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just one bucket, there's a number of them, and there's different policies around how we manage those buckets. From there, the buckets are actually replicated into a special AWS account in our environment, and we call this our bunker account. And so that's really designed to help protect against some of those scenarios in case of a compromised credential that wipes out the entire account. That bunker account only has one way in. It's got a separate set of IAM credentials and encryption keys, and really a separate way of accessing it as well. So there's kind of a similar break glass process in terms of having to get into that bunker account. And so if we did lose that whole other AWS production account, the idea is we could recover things out of the bunker account and continue servicing. From there, if we did lose the database server, as I mentioned, we can pull the backups out of the backups bucket or out of the bunker account if we need to, restore the database, and then repoint the application all through code, all in an automated fashion. And so that's kind of how we'd been doing things for a long time, and that was really good. But then we started to think, as we were moving our extreme risk workloads over, we had to think about really extremely unlikely scenarios. And one of the scenarios we started thinking about was the loss of all of our AWS accounts, including the bunker account. And so what we've effectively come up with is what we call our alternate hosting provider, or an alternate strategy to being able to continue providing service to our business. And it's really quite simple. Effectively, we replicate the backups bucket to a storage mirror at that alternate provider. From there, we're able to lose the entire AWS environment, be it a region or all of the accounts. And quite simply, we can stand things up from that storage mirror and restore the environment. Now, we only do this for our extreme risk workloads, our systems of record, the most sensitive things, as Wayne mentioned earlier, to our organization. We need to have confidence and have a way that we know we can restore service if there is a problem. And so this is something we've also built some automation around, and we're able to test quite frequently as well. And so then that kind of leads me into contingency. It's been really important for us to have a contingency plan, something that we can talk about, share externally, share internally with our executives and our board, but externally with our regulators as well. And we've really sort of broken it down into these areas. I think risk tiering is a really important approach. So for our low and medium risk applications, multi-availability zone patterns is completely fine. That's all we need. We don't need to do anything outside of that. And then as we move into the heightened extreme risk, we're looking at different options around how we ensure we've got a contingency plan. We also, as I touched on, had to make sure that we were establishing alternate service provider or some way of providing service in the event of those disruption scenarios that could occur, even the really unlikely ones. We made sure that all of our applications that were built in a portable manner for what made sense based on that risk tier. So we didn't use services that were hard to be portable if the application itself was an extreme risk application, for example. And then there's really a non-technical side to contingency as well, and that's something that you'll have to discuss with your AWS account team, but you really want to make sure that you've got the right commercial exit clauses in place. So if there is a non-technical reason and more of a commercial reason for moving away from AWS or moving away from the cloud, you want to make sure that you've covered, and you want to make sure that you've got enough time to make that exit in a timely fashion.
Thanks, Matt. So we'd just like to leave you with a few last insights and kind of consolidate some of the stuff that we've covered off here. I guess one of the things that we found is that your journey through cloud transition, and particularly when you start to look at systems of record, is going to be contextual to your particular scenario. As we mentioned before, it's customer dependent, regulatory dependent, your own risk culture dependent, these types of things. One of the traps we fell into early is we thought there must be a silver bullet. There must be one all-encompassing framework. If we can just do the things that this framework says and tick all of the boxes, we'll take that off to our regulator and happy days. It didn't work out that way. And as I kind of mentioned, it's an iterative process. You're going to build out what you think looks good. You need to test that yourself, and then you're going to have external rigor applied to that as well. So I guess be ready for ongoing dialogue, and that might be both with regulatory bodies or internally or with your cloud transition partners, but certainly, don't feel like it's all necessarily going to be something that you can get all your ducks in a row right up front. You need to build capability, and the teams are going to have to go on that journey as well. Use multiple frameworks and partners. So as I mentioned, don't feel there is no silver bullets. There's no one framework. Don't feel tied to any one particular framework. Use them all. Take what looks good, what's suitable for or appropriate for your own requirements, and model what your capability off the back of that. Using several partners has been really important for us as well. So we use a technical services or technical cloud transition partner, CMD Solutions of the Mantle Group. have been really great for us. And we also used a non-technical partner, Mark Zannon from Capital Consult, who helped us navigate things like changes to our operating model, helping us flesh out our risk registers and aggregate those in a presentable manner for our regulator, and a whole range of RACI and other type, soft control type stuff. And what's interesting for us, or one of the things that we found, was the transition from non-critical services adoption of cloud to critical services adoption of cloud is the shift from technical upfront thinking through to technical thinking being off the back end. And what I mean there is when the teams are starting to build up capability and flesh out the platform, it's very easy for them to kind of really get involved in investigating the services and playing around with those and building out capability, which is really important for kind of the teams understanding, developing maturity and understanding how they might use those skills later on when we look at migrating systems of record. However, the change is that all of a sudden you're bringing risk teams in, you're bringing security teams in and compliance teams to talk to those techos about service selection and why they need to apply things in a particular way, and that can lead to a bit of friction. So I think that it's important to try and get the teams thinking in that context early. And that kind of leads to my next point about this is so much about the people and so not about the technology, well, a bit about the technology, but cloud transitions change culture, and there's going to be roles that you hadn't conceived yet that you're going to need. There's going to be old roles that go away, and there's a whole range of issues that comes with that. Some people will go on the journey, some won't, and that's a significant thing to have to deal with. There's going to be a requirement for a lot of training. As you've seen, there's a lot of different services, both AWS and otherwise, that we've integrated into our platform. So the teams are going to have to deal with a lot of change. And I think the other important thing is that cloud transition programs, particularly ones that incorporate systems of record, they take a long time, and you can kind of lose the faith a little bit along the way. So it's important to manage upwards, have strong strategy, go back to that strategy, have good cloud steercos and governance committees that kind of bring you back to the reason why, and holding true to that, and navigating the journey that way. And just if you're thinking about doing this, or if you're already on the way, keep going, but get started now. As I said, one of the things that we fell into was there must be a right way, there must be an appropriate level of services or the right services, there must be one particular framework, and you can kind of get a little bit of that analysis or paralysis by analysis thing going on. So I think, of course, think through your journey, come up with a strategy, and look at the frameworks that you build upon. But certainly just get started and remember that it's that iterative process that we're going to need to go through. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate you listening to our journey. We hope that some of that is going to be useful or has been useful to you in your own journeys. Thanks again.
Thank you.